The morning my husband told me he wanted a divorce, I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing my son's cereal bowl. That detail still bothers me. Not the words he said, not even the way he said them. Calm, rehearsed, like he'd been practicing in the car on the way home from wherever he'd actually been. What bothers me is that I kept rinsing that bowl. I turned off the faucet, I set the bowl in the drying rack, and then I turned around and said, "Okay, tell me." His name was Kevin. We'd been married for 9 years. Our son Eli was 7 and sleeping 20 feet away, behind a door with a wooden train name tag he'd painted himself in first grade. Kevin said he'd met someone. Her name was Brooke. She was 26, 4 years younger than me, and her father owned 3 car dealerships and a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched across most of the greater Nashville area. Kevin said they'd been seeing each other for almost a year. He said he hadn't meant for it to happen. He said I deserved to know the truth. He left 2 weeks later. I want to be honest about what the months after that looked like, because I think a lot of people soften that part of the story, and I'm not going to. It was bad. Not dramatic bad, not movie bad. Just quietly, exhaustingly bad. The kind of bad where you're still packing Eli's lunch every morning and helping with spelling words every night and smiling at his soccer games on Saturday, and somewhere underneath all of that, you're doing math in your head that doesn't add up. Kevin had a lawyer before I even knew I needed one. By the time our divorce was finalized, I had the house, which had a mortgage I couldn't carry alone, and a child support arrangement that Kevin treated more like a suggestion than an obligation. He missed the first payment, then the second. His lawyer sent a letter explaining that Kevin had recently experienced financial instability due to a career transition. The career transition was that he'd quit his job at the logistics company to work for Brooke's father, which meant he was technically an at-will employee with a variable income, which meant, according to my attorney, that enforcing the support order would take time. I didn't have time. I had a 7-year-old and a mortgage and $400 in checking. I sold the house in March. Eli and I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Brentwood, which I chose specifically because it kept him in the same school district. That matters when you're a kid. Stability matters. I kept telling myself that the way you repeat something enough times that it starts to feel true even when it isn't. I had a job. I worked front desk at a physical therapy clinic. But the hours were inconsistent and the pay hadn't changed in 3 years. I'd been meaning to ask for a raise. I kept not asking. After Kevin left, I finally asked. My manager said the budget was frozen until Q4. That was February. I did the math on Q4 and I did the math on my rent, and the numbers still didn't meet in the middle. That's when I found the listing. It was on a care platform I'd signed up for on a whim, one of those sites where you can post yourself as a caregiver or a dog walker or a house sitter. I'd originally signed up thinking I'd pick up weekend babysitting shifts. The listing wasn't for babysitting. It read, live-in personal caretaker needed for elderly gentlemen, private estate, Franklin, TN. Private suite provided, meals covered. Compensation $1,800 at week. Must be patient, discreet, and available Sunday evening through Friday afternoon. Sunday evening through Friday afternoon. Which meant I'd be home every weekend. Eli stayed with my mother on the weekdays anyway. She'd retired the year before and had been asking to help more, and I'd been too proud to let her. I wasn't proud anymore. I called the number on the listing. A woman named Patricia answered. She said she was the household manager for a Mr. Edwin Gale. She said Mr. Gale was 81 years old, a widower, and had been experiencing what she described as behavioral and cognitive difficulties for the past 18 months. His family had hired and released 3 previous caretakers in the last year. She said the position required someone patient, someone observant, and someone who understood that Mr. Gale's moods could be, she paused, unpredictable. I asked her what unpredictable meant. She said, he has good days and difficult days. On difficult days, he may be confused or agitated or refuse to communicate. His physician has evaluated him, and while there are some concerns about his cognitive health, he has not been formally diagnosed with dementia. He's simply struggling. I told her I had a 7-year-old son and that I needed to be home on weekends. She said that was perfectly acceptable. I asked when I could start. She said, "Can you come for an interview on Thursday?" I told Eli I had a new job. I told him I'd be home every Friday afternoon and every Sunday morning and every bit of the weekend in between. I told him Grandma's house was basically a second home at this point. He had his own drawer there and everything, and that this was going to be okay. He looked at me for a second and then asked if we could get a dog eventually. I said, eventually. The Gale estate was about 20 minutes south of Nashville, set back from a county road behind an iron gate and a long gravel drive lined with oak trees. I'd driven past properties like it my whole life and never once thought I'd be sleeping in one. The house was a 3-story colonial, white with green shutters, with a back porch that looked out over a pond and about 12 acres of open land. Patricia met me at the front door, walked me through the main rooms, and then brought me upstairs to see the suite I'd be staying in. It was nicer than my apartment. I did not let myself think about that for very long. Patricia showed me Mr. Kate. Gale's daily routine, medications at 7 and 9 and 3 and 8, meals at consistent times, a short walk in the afternoon if weather permitted. She told me he'd been sleeping poorly. She told me he sometimes wandered the hallways at night. She told me to keep my door unlocked in case he needed assistance, but also to give him space when he seemed to want it. "Does he talk much?" I asked. "He used to," she said. "Less now. I met him before I left that day. He was sitting in a leather chair by the window in the study, a blanket over his lap despite the warmth in the room, and he was looking out at the pond. He didn't look up when Patricia introduced me. I said hello. He said nothing. I stood there for a moment, and then I said, 'Nice view.' And he turned his head just slightly and looked at me. His eyes were sharp. That surprised me. 'You're younger than the last one,' he said. 'Is that good or bad?' I asked. He looked back out the window. Remains to be seen. I started the following Sunday. My mother arrived at 4 to pick up Eli. He had his backpack and his soccer cleats and his dinosaur water bottle, and he hugged me for a long time at the door, longer than usual. He's a perceptive kid. He knew something was different, even if he couldn't name it. 'I'll call you before bed,' I told him. 'Every night?' he asked. 'Every single night,' I said. He nodded like that settled it and went out to Grandma's car. I arrived at the estate at 6. Patricia had left a binder on the kitchen counter with everything I needed: medication schedule, emergency contacts, the number for Mr. Gale's physician, the code for the security system, a list of foods he preferred and foods he refused. The house was quiet. Patricia didn't live in. She came Monday through Friday, 9 to 4, and weekends were covered by a rotating part-time aide, except for the Sunday evening to Friday slot, which was now mine. I made dinner. Chicken, roasted vegetables, nothing complicated. I brought it to the dining room. Mr. Pratt. Gale sat down without speaking, looked at the plate, and then looked at me. "Patricia usually just leaves it on the counter," he said. "I didn't know that," I said. "I can do that going forward if you prefer." He picked up his fork. "Sit down," he said. I sat. We ate in silence for most of the meal. Then, without preamble, he asked, "What happened to you?" I looked up. "You look like someone who recently had something happen to them," he said. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was cutting a piece of chicken with slow, deliberate movements. I've had enough people feel sorry for me to recognize what it looks like on someone else's face. I said my husband left. I needed work that let me be home on weekends for my son. He nodded slowly. "How old?" he asked. 7, I said. "Boy or girl?" "Boy. His name is Eli." He put down his fork and looked out the dark window toward the pond. "My wife and I had a daughter," he said. "She was the best thing that ever happened to either of us." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a long time ago. Things change." I didn't ask him to explain that. He didn't offer. After dinner, he went upstairs. I cleaned the kitchen, reviewed the medication log, and went to my suite. I called Eli. He was already half asleep, his voice slow and warm, telling me about a lizard he'd found in Grandma's backyard. I told him I loved him and to sleep well. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while after I hung up, in that nice room in that big quiet house, and I thought about how strange the distance was. Not far. 20 minutes from my apartment. Worlds apart from everything. I woke up at 2 in the morning. Not to an alarm, to sound. Footsteps, slow and uneven, in the hallway outside my door. I lay still for a moment, and then I heard something else. A voice. Low, steady, measured. Mr. Gale's voice. I couldn't make out the words. I got up, wrapped myself in the cardigan I'd left on the chair, and opened my door quietly. He was standing in the hallway about 15 feet away in his robe and slippers. He had his phone to his ear. He was listening, not speaking, and the expression on his face, it wasn't confusion. It wasn't the vague blankness Patricia had described. It was focused. It was deliberate. He turned and saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lowered the phone, pressed the screen dark, and said quietly, "Go back to sleep." "Are you all right?" I asked. "I'm fine," he said. "I often can't sleep. I walk. It helps." "Okay," I said. "Do you need anything?" He looked at me for a long moment. "No," he said. "Not tonight." I went back to my room. I didn't sleep for a while. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to notice things, small things at first. The way Mr. Gale's episodes, the confused, agitated behavior Patricia had described, seemed to follow a pattern. They were worst on the days his daughter visited. Her name was Sutton. She was 34, polished, and she arrived every Wednesday in a silver Mercedes with her husband, a man named Garrett, who had a firm handshake and eyes that moved around a room the way a person's eyes move when they're counting things. On Wednesdays, Mr. Gale barely spoke. He sat in his chair and stared and gave short, flat answers to questions, and sometimes, by the end of the visit, seemed genuinely disoriented, repeating himself, losing track of sentences mid-thought. But on Thursdays, when it was just the two of us, he was different. Thursday afternoons we took walks. He moved slowly but steadily. He talked about the land. He'd bought the property in 1987, built the house in 1991, raised Sutton there after her mother died when Sutton was 12. He told me about the business he'd built, a regional construction supply company that he'd grown from nothing and eventually taken partially public. He talked about his wife, Eleanor, with a quietness that was clearly still love, years later. He was sharp, dry-humored, observant. "You're not what I expected," he told me one Thursday, about 3 weeks in. We'd stopped at the edge of the pond to watch a heron standing perfectly still at the water's edge. "What did you expect?" I asked. "Someone who'd look at me the way the last 3 did," he said. "Like I was a problem to be managed." I thought about that. "You're not a problem," I said. "No," he said, "I'm not." The 4th Wednesday, I came downstairs earlier than usual and heard voices in the study before Sutton and Garrett knew I was in the house. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I came downstairs to refill Mr. Gale's water pitcher, and the door to the study was half open, and sound carries differently in old houses, differently and more honestly. Garrett was speaking. He had a particular way of talking that I'd noticed before, smooth and certain, the voice of someone who had spent a long time convincing people things were reasonable. He was saying something about a power of attorney. He was saying the evaluation had been clear enough. He was saying that waiting was unnecessary at this point. Mr. Gale said something I couldn't fully hear. Sutton's voice then, tight and careful. "Dad, this is just to protect you, in case something happens. You said yourself you've been having trouble." "I said I've been having trouble sleeping," Mr. Gale said. His voice was flat. "That's different. Dr. Harmon's notes, I know what they say." A pause. "Garrett's firm can handle all of it," Sutton said. "You wouldn't have to worry about any of it." "I don't want Garrett's firm handling all of it," he said. "I want to handle it myself." I took a step back from the door. My heart was going faster than made sense for someone standing still in a hallway. I went back upstairs. I refilled the pitcher from the bathroom sink instead. That evening, after Sutton and Garrett left, I brought Mr. Gale his 8 o'clock medication. He was quieter than usual. He took the pill, set down the glass, and stared at the wall for a moment. Then he said, without looking at me, "You heard something today." It wasn't a question. "I was nearby," I said carefully. "It's all right," he said. "I'd rather you know than not know." He looked at me then. "What do you think you heard?" I said. "I think I heard your son-in-law trying to talk you into signing something you don't want to sign." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's the polite version," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Garrett has been managing some of my business interests for the past 2 years, under an informal arrangement, nothing legally binding." He paused. "He'd like to change that. He's been working on Sutton for a while, and Sutton has been—" He stopped. He rubbed the side of his jaw with one hand. "She thinks she's protecting me, I believe that. I genuinely believe she thinks she's doing the right thing." "But Garrett doesn't think that," I said. "Garrett," he said, "is thinking about what happens when I die. Which will happen. I'm 81. He's been running the numbers." He looked down at his hands. My estate is substantial. If he holds power of attorney when I go, and if the will has been adjusted in certain ways that have been proposed to me over the last year, then what I built over 50 years goes primarily to managing partners of his firm and to accounts that Sutton may not even fully understand. I sat down slowly in the chair across from him. Have you talked to your own attorney? I asked. My attorney retired in 2021, he said. Garrett helped me transition to a new firm, his recommendation. A pause. I've been slow to understand what I was looking at. I'm not slow now. What are you going to do? I asked. He looked at me steadily. I've already done part of it. That phone call you walked in on, the 2 a.m. call, that was my accountant, the one from before. He still picks up. A brief, dry smile. We've been working on something for about 10 days. Does Patricia know any of this? I asked. Patricia knows I have good days and bad days, he said. The bad days on Wednesdays are deliberate. If they believe the progression is moving faster than it is, they move slower. It buys time. I stared at him. You've been performing it, I said. I've been surviving, he said. There's a difference. I want to tell you that I had some moment of clear, immediate heroism at that point. I didn't. I sat across from an 81-year-old man in a house I'd been sleeping in for less than a month, and I felt the particular weight of being a witness to something, the way a situation settles onto you, and you realize that walking away from it would be its own kind of choice. I said, What do you need? He said, I need a witness, and I need someone who will notice if things change quickly and can act accordingly. Act how? I asked. Contact the people I'll give you the names of, he said. My former attorney, she's retired, but she'll help. My accountant, a journalist at the Tennessean who covered my company when we went partial public in 2003, and who, I suspect, would find recent developments interesting. You've thought this through, I said. I've had 18 months of bad Wednesdays to think it through, he said. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no single confrontation, no moment where everything cracked open at once. It was methodical. Mr. Gale met twice with his former attorney who had agreed to come out of retirement for this specific matter. He had his will reviewed and properly re-executed with a notary and 2 witnesses who were not associated with Garrett's firm. He made a formal complaint with the Tennessee Board of Accountancy regarding certain transfers that his accountant had flagged as irregular. His new formal documentation named an independent executor, a longtime family friend and retired judge based in Memphis. I was not the hero of any of that. I drove him to 1 appointment. I kept track of his medication so his actual health stayed stable. I was there every Thursday afternoon when he needed to talk through what he was doing and why, and I listened, and I told him when something seemed unclear, and once I pointed out that a date on one of the documents didn't match what he'd described verbally, and he caught the discrepancy and it mattered. That's all I did. But sometimes that's enough. Sutton and Garrett came on a Wednesday in April. It was raining. I was in the kitchen. The meeting was in the study. I could hear the shape of it from the hallway. Not the words, but the rhythm, the way a conversation changes when something has shifted and one side hasn't caught up yet. I heard Garrett's voice go from smooth to edged. I heard Sutton's voice, toward the end, go quiet in a way that wasn't calm. Mr. Gale came out after they left. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired but not distressed. I showed them the updated documents, he said. How did they take it? I asked. Garrett wants to contest. He'll have a harder time than he's anticipating. He paused. Sutton cried. He looked down at the floor for a moment. I didn't enjoy that part. I know, I said. She kept saying she didn't know what Garrett had planned, he said. I'm not sure whether to believe her. Maybe both things can be true, I said. That she loved you and that she let someone who didn't love you get very close to something important. He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. I think both things are true. I stayed through May. By that point, the legal arrangements were finalized, and the accountancy complaint had been forwarded to appropriate parties, and Garrett had retained his own attorney, but Mr. Town, Gale's new independent executor, was handling everything with the kind of measured steadiness that came from 30 years on the bench. On my last Friday, Mr. Gale walked me out to my car. Ely was coming home that afternoon, and I'd promised we'd go to the park before dinner, and the weather had finally turned warm and green the way Tennessee gets in late spring. The specific shade of green that still feels like a small gift every year, even when you've seen it your whole life. He gave me an envelope at the car. I told him the salary was enough. He said, "It isn't, and this isn't severance. Read the letter inside." I read it that night, after the park, after dinner, after Eli was asleep. The letter explained that Mr. Quold, Gale had amended his estate plan to include a gift, not inheritance, but a formal gift, executed immediately, equivalent to 18 months of Eli's private school tuition at the school of my choosing, and a contribution to a legal fund to be used specifically to enforce my child support order in court. At the bottom, in handwriting that was slower and more deliberate than typeface but completely clear, he had written, "You noticed things other people had stopped looking for. That's not a small thing. Don't let anyone tell you it is." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The next week, I called the attorney's office and scheduled a hearing on Kevin's missed payments. The case took 4 months. Kevin's actual income, once properly documented through Garrett-adjacent business dealings that he'd used to hide earnings, turned out to be considerably more than he'd claimed. The support order was revised. The arrears were paid. Kevin did not call to apologize. I didn't need him to. Ailey got a dog in July, a brown and white beagle mix from the shelter 3 miles from our apartment. He named her Scout, after the character in the book we'd been reading together at bedtime. The book about a little girl who learns to pay attention to things, to notice what's true even when the adults around her can't see it yet. I thought that was a good name. I thought he understood something at 7 years old that had taken me considerably longer to learn, that paying attention is not a passive thing, that noticing is a choice, that sometimes the most important thing you can do in a situation is simply refuse to look away. I keep thinking about that cereal bowl. The fact that I rinsed it and set it in the rack before I turned around to face what was happening. At the time, I thought that said something unflattering about me, that I was so conditioned to keeping things orderly that I couldn't even let myself fall apart for 30 seconds. But I've changed my mind about that. I think I was already doing what I would keep doing for the next year, choosing in small and unglamorous ways to keep going. That's not a dramatic quality. It doesn't make a good story on its own. But I've come to believe it's the thing that actually carries you through, not the big decisive moments, but the 10,000 small ones where you could stop and you don't, where you could look away and you choose to look closer instead. Edwin taught me something about that, without intending to. Here was a man who had every reason to give up. He was 81. His own daughter had slowly been handed over, emotionally, to someone who was quietly working to dismantle everything Edwin had spent his life building. He could have signed the papers. He could have decided that at his age, the fight wasn't worth it. Instead, he made phone calls at 2 in the morning. He paid attention to his own calendar. He noticed the patterns in what was happening, and he thought clearly about them, and then he acted. Not dramatically, methodically. He was sharper in that leather chair, under that blanket, than most people I've known who were 30 years younger and had every advantage he didn't. That's what real intelligence looks like to me now. Not the kind that impresses people in meetings. The kind that stays honest with itself about what's actually happening, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the people causing the problem are people you love. Kevin's leaving didn't break me because I was weak. It broke open something I'd been keeping closed. The part of me that had been deferring for years to someone else's version of what our life was. I'd known the numbers didn't add up long before that morning at the sink. I'd known things were off. I chose not to look directly at it. That's not a moral failing exactly. It's something most of us do when the truth is costly. But there's a price for that too, and eventually it comes due. What I'm grateful for, if I'm being honest, is that when it came due for me, I was still young enough to rebuild. And I had Eli, who needed me to be functional more than he needed me to be okay, and that distinction between functional and okay turned out to be the most useful one I'd learned in my adult life. I'm not the same person I was when Kevin left. I'm more careful now about what I agree to, about whose version of events I accept without question. I ask more and trust more slowly. That's not cynicism. It's the difference between being passive and being awake. Edwin paid a steep price to learn that lesson late. I got to learn it at 32, which, in the long run, was a gift, even if it didn't feel like one at the time. Eli named his dog Scout. He said it was after the character in the book. But I think he also just liked the word, the idea of it. Someone who goes ahead and looks. Someone who pays attention to what's actually there. I'm trying to be that person. I'm still learning how.